Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda and I'm so glad to see you today. Now, today's video is one that quite honestly is one of the biggest things I struggled with during my conversion to Judaism. This is also one of the things that continues to kind of be a challenge as I live my life, when me and my amazing boyfriend have dinners with my family, things like that. We are talking today about the laws of kashrut, or the laws regarding food and if it's kosher or not. It's an important one. There's many different facets. And if you are coming to Judaism or you know someone who is Jewish, this is likely going to be very new for you. And unfortunately, there are many variations as people interpret the rules slightly differently. So even what I go over today, there may be people who modify the rules slightly so that it works for them in their life. So the best thing to do, if you have someone in your life who is Jewish or is in the process of becoming Jewish, or they just observe a kosher diet, as it's called, ask them what they mean by that specifically so that you can help support them. Because as we'll read today and as we'll learn today, keeping kosher isn't easy, but sometimes people make it more difficult or challenging than it needs to be. So, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the perfect place to get started is asking what exactly is kosher. What does that mean? So kosher in and of itself is, it just means that it's good. Okay? So by following kosher eating or kosher diet, you are following certain rules and practices for different reasons. Now, how many people keep kosher? Many people say that it's really, really difficult. It's not difficult in and of itself. What is difficult is that everybody else doesn't do kosher. So there are many products that you have to look at very carefully. You have to clean things carefully. You have to be on alert and questioning if you're at a restaurant, things like that. It's a lot of extra steps that when I was a Christian and I could eat whatever I want, I didn't have to think about. So I'm not perfect, and I still don't think about it sometimes as much as I should, but it's becoming more of a conscious effort on my part. By research, there is typically 1% of the United States population that is Jewish. Now, according to a 2020 research, 17% of those that claim to be Jewish report that they keep a kosher home. Okay, fully kosher home. Now, there are many different types, variations, and styles, so we're going to talk about all of that. Do not worry. But it's a big deal as part of Judaism, the diet, the kosher diet. So many people may have a full kosher home. Some people may just not eat certain products. Some people will just eat certain products on very rare occasion. Everybody's different, and there's not a judgment for that. It's not like, oh, if you have a kosher home, you're better than somebody who has a bacon cheeseburger every 3 months. That doesn't exist. There's not a judgment system there. It's a big deal for Judaism, though, because in the Torah, which is the holy book of scriptures that the Jewish people believe Moses wrote down as dictated by God, there are 613 laws or mitzvot that God instructs the Jewish people to hold or keep, okay? Of those 613, 30 of them are involving food. So it's a big deal. So I would say a majority of the Jewish people do some kind of Jewish diet acknowledgement, okay? And we're going to go into that a little bit more. Did you know that there are people who are not Jewish and keep kosher? There are. There are people of all different backgrounds. Muslims will use kosher items, Seventh-day evangelists and vegetarians, all because kosher isn't necessarily a blessing that's said on the food. It's about a very systematic and observed way of ensuring the food is prepared. So whether that's observing how the animals are raised and how they're slaughtered, observing how the wheat is grown, what is put on it, how that's harvested, things like that. That whole process is the koshering, okay? Now, there are people who live a kosher diet and there are people who don't. Completely their choice. But many people choose to live a kosher diet because, again, 30 of the 615 mitzvot are about food. They believe that they keep a kosher diet because God has commanded us to in the 30 laws. They also say that they are doing that because the sages, or the really wise people from a long time ago, have pointed out the health benefits, the importance of humane treatment of animals, the ability to unify a group of dispersed people. So there are Jewish people throughout the entire world, and they're not a large number. However, by keeping kosher or observing kosher dietary laws, it's a way to join that group together. And then lastly, it's a shield from assimilation. There's many warnings in the Torah about assimilation or changing yourself to fit your surroundings too much. By making sure that you take the extra effort to watch what you're eating, that helps prevent one from assimilating to that culture and straying too far from the laws in the Torah. Okay? So there are many products today that are kosher or certified, and there are many that are not. There are traditionally four symbols that are most common, and I'm going to put them up over here. There is a U with a circle, a K within a little, it almost looks like a bracket. It's actually a Hebrew letter. There's a K within a circle, and there's a K within a star. All of those are different organizations who have assured that product, that ingredient, that whatever has been raised humanely, gathered humanely, created humanely, and it's also produced on machine or with machines or with items that are kosher. So there's a whole process with it. It's not a blessing over the food. It's that specific watching and maintaining detail. Now there is another symbol. It's a P that's typically next to it, or P with an exclamation mark, and that's a special certification, meaning that it's kosher for Passover. Passover is a specific time in the Jewish calendar where they remember the time where the Jewish people were in the desert and they had limited access to a lot of things. So they purposely limit their access to different things during Passover. And everything is much more strict during Passover. So very interesting. Looking in my cupboards, you would think that many items would be non-kosher because I live in a small town. And yes, there are some items that are non-kosher. However, very easily, I was able to find an item that was kosher. So if you look on the package way down here, let's see if I can get you to focus in on that. You see that U with the circle? That's a kosher symbol. And if you're going to the grocery store and you just look for the symbols, the U with the circle, the K and a star, the K and a circle, things like that, you'll be surprised at how many items are kosher. Now, in bigger cities, there are whole grocery stores where everything is kosher. And I do have to admit, it might be cool to go to one of those someday, just because I'm sure there are foods out there that I do not know. Word of warning, if it is a single K and nothing else with it, that does not necessarily mean that it's kosher. The symbols that I listed before, the U in a circle, the K in a circle, the K in a star, the K inside the Hebrew letter, those are all trademark symbols. However, any company can put just the letter K on a package. So the letter K itself does not mean that it's certified kosher. It just means that that company thinks it's kosher. And depending on the individual, that may or may not suffice. Okay, so we've talked a lot about being kosher so far and what it means. We're going to get into the nitty gritty in a little bit about like what items are kosher, what items are not kosher. But I'm going to make a little caveat first. So let's pretend you are going to a dinner party or a birthday party or something like that at a friend's house, and that friend happens to keep a kosher diet. Now, I was always taught that it is rude to arrive at someone's house empty-handed. So frequently in my family, we have dishes that we will bring to contribute to the larger meal. In a kosher household, if they're keeping kosher or strict kosher, that typically would be appreciated, but they will not put your dishes out. They're not being rude, they're not being disrespectful, but in their kosher household, there's certain cleaning, there's certain products. They don't know what foods have been in the dish before, what ingredients were used to make that dish. Were those ingredients kosher? Was there the cleanliness that is required for kosher kitchens when this dish was being cooked? They don't know that. So out of respect for you, they will likely take your dish and put it in the fridge or something. They won't be bringing it out to that party. A much better option, if you are going to someone's house who is kosher, who keeps kosher, they would appreciate either a kosher wine, and again, those kosher symbols are on many bottles of wine, or you could bring them some kosher chocolates, or even just flowers. Flowers are easy. There are no kosher and non-kosher flowers. So you could certainly do any one of those, and that would be much more widely appreciated. Just because different people have different kosher laws, and you may be stricter observance of kosher and they may be stricter observance of kosher. So just to avoid the concern, they're just going to eliminate the whole thing and they're going to keep it on the side. Okay, so that's what they do. So talking about keeping kosher, it is more than just the food. In a kosher household with the diet, again, depending on their understanding of the laws, there are people who are very strict and there are people who are not as strict. There are people who have 2 to 3 full sets of dishes, one for dairy, one for meat, one for parve. Parve is like middle ground. It's not, it can go with meat or dairy. They might have utensils that are specifically for meat or specifically for dairy. They may have 2 different ovens. They may have 2 different stovetops, 2 different sinks, 2 different dishwashers, or at least different racks on where they wash their dishes. Now, it may seem a bit excessive, but it all goes back to this one law in particular that people have struggled with. And it's found 3 different times It's Exodus 23, verse 19, Exodus 34, verse 26, and Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21. And it's, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So different people have different understandings and interpretations of that. Some people believe that you shouldn't cook, or meat and milk should not exist in the same presence together. Some people say, well, you just can't cook them together, but you can ingest them together. Some people say that only matters if it's exactly that cow and exactly that cow's baby, for example. And some people say it matters with just the intention of what you're doing. If you're doing it for harm or if you're doing it for good. It's all the variances are based on people's interpretation. Okay? So it's just different, and every person is different. In the kitchen, depending on their observance levels, they may even have different pot holders for meat and dairy and parve. They may have different sinks, as I mentioned. If you brought a dish and they didn't know if it was kosher, they would then need to, it's called kasher, their kitchen. So anything that was touched, they have to heat to a high temperature to burn off whatever remnants there were. Or they would have to go to a mikveh and they would have to dunk them in there while saying the blessings, then come home and wash them, and then they would be safe for consumption again, or safe to use with consumption again. Every person is different. I can tell you, in my household, I only have one set of dishes and one stove and one sink and one set of utensils because I live in a small town, and that law to me is not that excessive. I interpret it different ways. Okay? So let's talk about some of the foods that are kosher, some of the foods that are not kosher, and how to know. Okay, so we're going to start with the easy one, fruits and vegetables. All fruits and vegetables are kosher. All of them. However, when you buy a fruit or vegetable, you have to be careful. Even if you grow it in your own garden, you have to be careful because it is against kosher rules to eat bugs or worms. So when you get fruit or vegetables, it's important to wash them and wash them thoroughly, whether you grow them in your own garden or you get them in the grocery store. Even if you get it and it's pre-washed, typically people will wash it again just to ensure that there are no bugs or worms. And they'll also do a careful inspection. In some households, again, there is someone whose job is to examine all of the fruits and vegetables to ensure that there are no bugs or worms before it is made a part of a meal. Okay, so all fruits and vegetables, good to go. So many vegetarians will actually follow kosher laws because it makes it a little bit easier for them. Okay, now talking about the meat and dairy separation, that's where the big controversy is. There are people who say you cannot have meat and dairy together, but you can have fish and dairy together. Some say you can't have fish and dairy together. Some say you can have dairy and eggs together, so like for an omelet, but some say you can't. Some say, well, if you eat meat and then dairy, you have to wait 6 hours for that meat to digest in your stomach before you can before the meat to digest in your stomach before you can ingest dairy. Well, others say if you eat dairy first, you just have to wait either 3 hours, or you need to rinse your mouth out first, or you need to eat something that's parve in the middle to cleanse that from your mouth. Again, it's everyone's interpretation. Now, myself, I eat meat and dairy together. I don't believe that do not boil a kid in its mother's milk means that you can't eat milk and meat together, or dairy and meat together. I don't believe that. That's not my observances. Now, I am careful to make sure that what I'm eating is good quality, that the animals are treated humanely, that that everything that I'm eating is bug free. Things like that I am very careful about. Okay, let's talk about the meat, because that's a big part of the kosher rules. Okay, so there are 4 different areas of meat or protein, if you want to look at it. The first one we're going to talk about is mammals. So in the Torah, the rule is that to eat a mammal, it must have split hooves and chew its cud. So by that rule, the kosher meats are cows, sheep, goats, and deer. Okay. Now, on a cow, I should note, and I would venture to guess many other animals, there are certain cuts of meat that are okay, and there are certain cuts of meat that are not okay. So in this example of a cow, you'll notice that the front part, you can eat their kosher items. In the back part, the sirloin, the loin, the round, and the flank, because there are so many nerves and arteries in there, that makes it difficult to kosher that meat. And we're going to talk about that whole process when we get to the slaughtering. Typically, a Jewish butcher would not sell the second half. The second half of that animal would be reserved for people who are non-Jewish, who don't follow kosher laws. Now, does that mean that sometimes the meat is more expensive? Absolutely. The slaughtering practices also typically indicate that the meat or the food costs are going to be more expensive because it's more carefully and diligently watched and carried out. Okay, because it has to have split hooves and calves, pigs are out. Pigs have split hooves. They do not chew their cud. Rabbits, squirrels, dogs, bears, cats, camels, horses, Jewish people can't eat any of those. Are there people who choose to eat rabbit or pork? Yeah. Am I going to judge them for that? No. Am I personally going to eat rabbit or cat or dog or pork? No. That's my personal choice. Okay. The next area looking at protein is fowl or birds. In the Torah, it lists specifically 24 different kinds of birds that we're not supposed to eat. Now, these birds are typically predatory birds. So it's like eagle, osprey, hawk, falcon, owl, vulture, buzzard, swan, and ostrich. Can't eat them. Now, I don't know who necessarily was like, ooh, shucks, I can't eat a buzzard. That's not something I would ever want. But I do know that like ostrich and ostrich eggs in particular are they're a pretty kind of fancy thing. I know ostrich omelets are something that people talk about just because of the size of the ostrich eggs. But the birds that are good to eat, according to Torah, are chickens, ducks, geese, and turkeys. You can eat all of them. And those are the more common ones, so I'm completely good with that. In the area of reptiles, amphibians, worms, and insects, again, I mentioned that bugs and worms typically are not kosher items. We don't eat them. However, there are exceptions. There are 4 bugs that are deemed appropriate to eat by kosher laws. So that is locusts, katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers. So if you really wanted to have that chocolate covered cricket, you're good. Me personally, no thanks, I'm good. But there are different parts of the world who have different protein sources. And I think it's awesome the way that the Torah covers the protein that would be available in all those different areas. Okay. The last area of protein that the Torah covers is regarding fish and seafood. And what the Torah says is that to eat a water animal, it must have both fins and scales. So salmon, tuna, pike, flounder, carp, and herring, all kosher. And those are probably more of the common fish that you would eat. Catfish, sturgeon, swordfish, lobster, crab, and shellfish are not. And that was probably, when I was switching over to more of a kosher diet, that was probably the one that was the trickiest for me. I used to love shrimp. and I would have lobster on occasion, or I would have crab legs. And that was something that was always really special to me growing up. It's something that my mom enjoyed. It's something that my sisters enjoyed. So that was something that I enjoyed partaking in as well. And that was, many people, when they switch from having a non-kosher diet to a kosher diet, they long for bacon. I don't. I will admit that on occasion I long for some shrimp. Now, the reason that the Torah outlines some of these shellfish and pork and things like that, it's because they can't reach the cleanliness level through cooking and cleaning that the Torah prescribes. There is no way, for example, to cook protein for all of the bacteria to be eliminated. It eliminates most of it through different cooking, but not all. In shellfish, there is no way to eliminate all of the bacteria while cooking. So that's why that is not allowed. And certain people, again, depending on their kosher laws, some people will eat just kosher food that is at, say, a buffet. And some people, if it's kosher food and it's intermingled, there's different bowls of non-kosher food, some people won't eat there. For example, so my food choice is, I'm not fully kosher, but I am definitely observant, and I don't eat pork and I don't eat shellfish anymore, things like that. However, my amazing boyfriend's daughter, she lives in a fully kosher household. So even having food present that is not kosher makes the food that is kosher unacceptable and confusing. So they avoid that whole situation. So as much as I would love to have my amazing boyfriend's daughter come around my family for eating and things like that, right now that doesn't work, because her observance level and my observance level are very different, and she's also a child, so it's very confusing to see these great foods in front of you and be told that you can't eat them. And it's nothing that my family is doing wrong, it's just they don't understand the different observance levels, and so it makes it difficult for everybody to get together currently. Okay, so we talked about the meat, but did you know that you can have a cow, and depending on how it's slaughtered, that cow, which was kosher, can very easily become non-kosher. There's a very specific slaughtering method for kosher animals. It's painless, and it causes unconsciousness for the animal within 2 seconds. It is widely recognized as the most humane method of slaughter possible. However, because of the specific timing and of everything, it makes the meat much more costly. Okay. The slaughter is done with a very sharp, unblemished knife, and it's one smooth motion. It's very precise, and it can only be done by someone who is highly trained, Torah observant, God-fearing, and they must be certified. So in small communities, frequently it'll be a rabbi who has been trained to do this. In many places, there are other people. There are kosher butchers who will do it as well. It's a whole different level. It's not like factory producing food. Not knocking different companies, but like some companies will stun the animal and then slaughter them in a way where it's more painful or lengthy for the animal to pass. And that's not the kosher way to slaughter an animal. It's deemed as inhumane and not appropriate. So that's that whole process. We know that there are different kinds of meat that are appropriate for eating kosher. We know there are different cuts of meat that are appropriate for eating in kosher. There are different ways of slaughter that are appropriate for kosher. But after an animal is even slaughtered, say you have a cow, it was raised in a kosher style, it was slaughtered in a kosher style. After it is slaughtered, what they will do is they will examine the internal organs of the cow for any potentially fatal diseases or injuries. They're looking for adhesions or bumps or certain things, specifically on the lungs, holes in the stomach, things like that. If they examine those internal organs and they see something that's not to that level or not kosher, then that whole animal, all that meat, is deemed non-kosher. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not fit for consumption. It's just not fit for consumption by kosher observant Jews. It's just their level of standard. Okay? So, that's the slaughtering process. Now, I spoke earlier about that different symbol, that P with the K or that P with the U in the circle, and those being for Passover. So I researched a little bit more about Passover and different rules, because during Passover there are different requirements, okay? During Passover, by the Jewish people, they call it Pesach. They will go around and they're not allowed to eat grains that have been raised or fermented. So no breads, no pastas, no legumes, no beans, no liquor, no soda in some regards. If it has high fructose corn syrup, some people won't do that. But again, there's that range of how observant they will be. I will say on the whole, most Jewish people during Passover or Pesach up their level of observation in the Jewish diet. That's just what they do. The only bread that is allowed is matzah, and that is, depending on your area, either a flat cracker-like substance, kind of like a saltine, but it doesn't have the salt nor a butter flavor. So it's a very dry, flaky, kind of like cardboard. It's not necessarily appealing, but some people love it. There are all kinds of recipes to try to doctor it up. I haven't found one that makes it spectacular yet. But there are also different versions where the matzah is more thick and chewy, almost like a pita bread, okay? Just based on their different accounts and where they live. And so during the Passover, there are different foods that are forbidden, and those are the ones that are fermented or grain-like. Their problems. So there are specific cleaning practices. When Pesach is coming, frequently people will clean their entire kitchen. They'll put tinfoil down on the shelves and on the countertops. They're creating a barrier for chametz, which are little crumbs that have been left behind of grain that was previously used. It's also, again, depending on the household, it is very possible that there will be a whole set of non-kosher goods that they can no longer use, but it's not consumption. So there are people who will only use kosher shampoo or kosher hygiene products or kosher toothpaste during that week. There are some people who say, okay, that's going a bit too far and I'm going to use my regular toothpaste. I'm just going to worry about the food that's ingested. It's different observances. And again, it's not a judgment about what different people observe, how they observe, things like that. Now, you may wonder why there are different observances for different things. I talked about the matzah, for example, how they're different. And that's really because of the different origins of the Jewish people. So there are different groups. Jewish people are all over the world, and based on where they live and their cultural traditions, sometimes they change or make exemptions based on their current rabbis in the area about practices that are deemed appropriate for them. So here's a map of the main different areas. So there's the Ashkenazi, and those are more the German-based, European-based. There's the Sephardic, who is in Spain and some of those upper African areas. There's this Mizrahi, and then there's a whole bunch of independent groups who are very, very small, like the Ethiopian Jews and things like that, who have modified the rules slightly so that it reflects what their cultural practices are. Okay, so we're going to look specifically at Passover because that's something that all Jewish people celebrate, but it's the easiest place to see where some of the differences are. In America, Jewish people represent 1% of the population. 95% of that 1% of the population are of the Ashkenazi strand. So more of the German-based, European-based Jew. The rest of them are mostly Sephardic, so more of the Mediterranean-based, but everybody's different, and that's okay. So during Pesach, I mentioned before that there are certain foods that are avoided. Ashkenazi, they avoid beans, legumes, corn, and rice. In the Sephardic movement, some people will do the exact same. They will avoid beans, legumes, corn, and rice during Pesach. However, some say, okay, but rice, beans, and peas, they're okay. So as a person who struggles going through Passover without many starches, I can tell you that if I could have rice, game changer. If I could have chickpeas, game changer. But that's not the version I practice. I'm Ashkenazi because of my German heritage. So sometimes people are very jovial about it and say, oh, everybody wants to be a Sephardic Jew during Pesach. That's just what they do. And again, in Sephardic, there's always a variance. So in Morocco, for example, they don't eat rice, but they will eat beans. Okay? In Uzbekistan, the Jews there say, okay, yes to rice, no to beans. That's just what they do. It's different depending on their cultural experience. So that's just what they do. Matzah, like I said, there's two different versions. The Sephardic or the German version is thicker. I'm sorry, the Ashkenazi is the German version or the European version. That's the thin cracker-like one. The Sephardic one is more thick and fluffy and soft, more like a pita or a falafel bread. Okay. Now, during the Passover service, there's a special meal. It's called a Seder. There's different things that happen. And one of the things, they take some greens, so some celery, some parsley, things like that, and they'll dip them in a fluid and then eat it. The fluid is supposed to remind them of the tears of the people when they were in exile. The Ashkenazi, so the European strand or the German strand, they tend to dip theirs in salt water. The Sephardic, they dip theirs in either vinegar or lemon juice. Different, just based on their cultural traditions. It's what has been deemed appropriate by the rabbi in their area. Okay, and then just interesting ones when I was doing research. Another difference is there are some scallions that are on the Seder plate. And in the Sephardic tradition, they're kind of jovial and a little bit more spirited. There's a song that is sung during the Seder service. And what they'll do is they'll take the thing and they're whipping their neighbors during this song. Because it reminds them of when the slaves were whipped in Egypt. It's just funny. I can imagine people laughing when they do that. They will also take it's called haroset, and it's like apples and spices all like mixed together. It's kind of like a chunky applesauce, if you want to say that. And whatever is left, they will smear it on the outside of their door to remind them of Passover when they put lamb's blood over the door. So the angel of death, I believe it was, the plague of death would pass over their house. And there also is the tradition in Sephardic traditions that when they are starting the Seder, they will shout the arrival of Moshe from the doorway. So again, they're just very, very jovial, very fun about it. It's a very big party. They do a lot more food and they do a lot more drinking and all kinds of things. It's interesting that even in the kosher laws, there is such variance. Now, I understand that for my family in particular, that makes it different because they just would like me to be, here's a handbook and it works for everyone, and it doesn't. My kosher observance is different than my amazing boyfriend. His observance is different than his daughter's. And that's okay. My observance level is different than people at my synagogue. That's okay. It's how you interpret the passages in the Torah, and it's taking that extra step, that extra effort to be diligent and mindful of what you are putting into your body so that you are acknowledging Hashem and all the gifts that He has given you, and you're making a conscious effort to take care of the gifts that He's given you, which is pretty awesome, I think. Overwhelming? Yes. When I was studying, living a kosher household, it was extremely overwhelming. I didn't have a clue how I was going to have a kosher household in my small town where there's not a kosher butcher. I was not offered, but I was encouraged that, well, it's just easier if you just become a vegetarian. It would be, but I don't know if you can tell, but I am not a skinny girl, and I like my meat. I am German background, and I'm used to eating, and to not have that meat or protein would be really, really tough for me. And that's not something that I thought Hashem wanted me to give up. So I struggled with figuring out how I would have a kosher household and what that kosher household looked like to me. Again, not judging other people, just trying to figure out what works for me. So here's where I am, and where I am may change. If someday I get a house that has 2 ovens, as that's becoming more of a common thing, maybe I'll have more of a full kosher kitchen with 2 different sets of pots and 2 different ovens and 2 different dishes. Maybe not. I don't know. Only the future will tell. But where I am right now is making conscious efforts to be diligent about what is in my household and what I'm ingesting. So I hope you learned something in today's video. I hope this cleared up a little bit of the confusion of kosher eating. If I didn't do such a great job and you'd like me to expand on something more, please feel free to let me know and I will do my very best. But I hope you had a great day today. I'm glad you learned something, because the more we learn, the more we grow. The more we grow, the more we know. So until next time, take care.